On the 6th of August 2026, the Wall Street Journal reported a new US intelligence assessment. Vladimir Putin could try to test NATO sometime between this year and 2029. Anything from a cyber attack all the way up to, in the most extreme case, a limited land incursion. The most likely target, the Baltics or Poland. The instinct is to picture tanks. That's probably wrong. What Putin will most likely apply is asymmetric testing, and the sharpest version of that test already has a name, the Suwalki Gap. 65 kilometers of Polish-Lithuanian border, squeezed between Kaliningrad and Belarus. NATO's version of India's chicken neck. Block that road, that rail junction, that stretch of airspace NATO uses to move anything between Poland and the Baltic states, and you've just found, cheaply, deniably, whether NATO still has balls. And this isn't a scenario waiting politely for its first data point. One day before that, the Wall Street Journal report landed. An explosives-laden drone turned up at Leipzig Halle airport in Germany, parked next to a cargo plane full of military ammunition fresh off a flight from France. Germany's interior minister didn't outplay it, saying, quote, a new quality of danger, in his words, a hybrid attack scenario. The only reason it didn't go off, per investigators, might just be a technical malfunction. Luck, in other words. Russia's embassy in Berlin calls it a quote, contrived provocation and denies everything, which is exactly what you'd say either way. Nobody's proven who sent it, but notice the target, military logistics, in transit, on NATO soil, the same category this video is about to hit again with Rheinmetall. This is what the theory looks like while it's actively happening.
This isn't abstract theorizing about a country that's never shown its hand either. This goes back to a Russia-linked cyber attack that crippled Estonia's government and banks in 2007, almost 20 years of probing, long before anyone had heard of Zapad. Which brings us to what just happened this past September. Zapad 2025, the joint Russia-Belarus military exercise, ran from the 12th to the 16th, with Russian claims of around 100,000 personnel involved, although Western estimates vary wildly. Anywhere from 30,000 to up to 150,000 troops were involved. NATO sent observers. Poland and the Baltic states watched every move, and for good reason. The last Zapad exercise in 2021 was used in part as cover for moving Russian troops into Belarus that then rolled straight into Ukraine 4 months later, in February 2022. An exercise is not just an exercise. Sometimes it's a rehearsal. Sometimes it's a staging operation wearing a rehearsal's uniform, and you don't find out until it's too late to matter. The board is already set for this specific spot. Kaliningrad sits loaded, roughly 12,000 Russian troops, backed by Iskander ballistic missiles that can hit targets across the entire Baltic region without warning. On the other side of the gap, NATO's enhanced forward presence has scaled up from battalion to brigade-sized battalions. Canada leading in Latvia, Germany in Lithuania, the UK in Estonia, the US in Poland, roughly 22,000 troops total, with a ninth battle group led by Sweden standing up in Finland this past June. And this isn't just numbers on a briefing slide somebody in Brussels will forget by Friday. The frontline states are out there pouring actual concrete over it. Poland's East Shield, $2.5 billion, 700 kilometers of bunkers and barriers along the Russian and Belarusian border. Lithuania's throwing 5 to 6% of its entire GDP at defense through 2030, the highest ratio in all of NATO by a mile, and building a training facility right on top of the Suwalki Gap itself, plus a deal to assemble 41 Leopard tanks at home. Say whatever you want about Brussels being asleep at the wheel, the people who actually live next to the border clearly are not. So what hasn't happened yet, and what an actual test would mean, is the Crimea playbook. Unmarked soldiers, deniable at first, a manufactured pretext about protecting a population, a fait accompli before anyone can agree on how to respond. That's the real template. not tanks rolling openly across a border in daylight, a few days of confusion about who's shooting and why, timed for exactly the movement nobody in Brussels can agree fast enough to do anything about. And can't agree fast enough isn't rhetorical. It's built into NATO's own rulebook. Article 4 just means everyone sits down and talks. No obligation to do anything. Article 5, the actual collective defense trigger, deliberately doesn't define what counts as an armed attack, specifically so member states keep room to maneuver case by case. And it requires consensus. Hybrid and deniable tactics exist precisely to sit below whatever threshold that consensus would actually trigger. That's not a flaw Russia is exploiting by accident. Ambiguity is the entire point of a test. Force NATO into Article 4 consultation mode and see if it ever reaches Article 5 or just talks. And that's worth being precise about, because it's easy to hear limited incursion and assume the goal is territory. It isn't. Combined NATO military strength dwarfs Russia's. Nobody serious thinks Moscow can win a straight fight. Daniel Hamilton, a former US State Department official who spent decades on NATO strategy, put it plainly in an interview with Deutsche Welle days after the Wall Street Journal report. The real intent isn't a military victory. It's to, quote, befuddle the political decision-making within NATO, quote, enough that individual allies start stepping back from Ukraine or from the alliance itself. A limited incursion doesn't need to hold ground to work. It just needs to prove NATO can't agree fast enough to matter. And Russia doesn't need to wait for the gap itself to start pressure testing the alliance's supply lines. Look at what's actually being built right now, because it tells you where the pressure already sits. On the 8th of July, Ukraine signed a license to begin producing Patriot interceptors itself, the missile that's kept much of the airspace defended throughout its war. The first production isn't happening in Ukraine. That's too dangerous. Germany's the likely site, one of the few countries left in the European Union which still holds the necessary industrial capacity to necessitate the production of these military systems. Russia already has a track record here. Earlier this year, US intelligence uncovered a Russian plot to assassinate the CEO of Rheinmetall, the German arms manufacturing arming Ukraine. Medvedev said openly Russia would strike any Rheinmetall facility set up inside Ukraine. A German Patriot factory isn't a hypothetical target, it's the next name on a list that already exists. So if Moscow is trying to model how Ukraine actually responds under pressure, not what it says, what it does, there are two recent real data points to work with, and they point in completely different directions. In March, during the Iran war, 4 Iranian ballistic missiles got intercepted over the Turkish airspace by NATO air defenses. All 4 shot down. NATO condemned it formally, and then nothing further. No wider retaliation, no Article 5. Mark Rutte did the classic European move. Say the strong sentence and change nothing. Active defense and zero escalation. And that's not the only flavor of this wimpiness. In January, when Trump renewed pressure to annex Greenland, the response was completely different, and at least rhetorically, much louder, supposedly. If loud means a chihuahua barking at a pit bull, an emergency EU summit, a unified statement that annexation would be, quote, a gross breach of international law, that little chihuahua is barking a threatened $107 billion retaliatory package, which is essentially a rhetorical price tag, and then the actual troop commitment on the ground, which is basically 38 troops. 38 troops. France sent 15 mountain specialists. Germany, 13 personnel. Sweden, 3 officers. Finland and Norway, 2 each. The UK and the Netherlands, 1 each. Wow, that is very scary. Real economic leverage. No military playbook for a threat coming from inside your own alliance. Most of Europe is functionally essentially an American vassal. And this was the response of the vassals. How exactly do you militarily stand up to the mafia boss who's also your protection racket? And not when your nuclear umbrella and your entire defense architecture are interlinked with the country doing the threatening. If the Americans had actually wanted Greenland, wimpy Europe would have had about as much political will to stop them as France had stopping the Germans marching into Paris in 1940. A demilitarized Chihuahua doesn't beat a pit bull, historic exceptions aside. Putin's banking on exactly this, a Europe with no appetite for anything past strongly worded statements, right up until the first shot actually lands in Poland, Lithuania, or Germany itself. That's when the rhetoric meets reality. Fight or let Poland have it out with a pit bull alone while Brussels keeps living in La La Land. And this isn't just a vibe either. In June, Pete Hegseth announced a 6-month Pentagon review for the entire US military footprint in Europe. Troops, aircraft, bases, the whole inventory. Verdict due early 2027. The pitch is Europe grows up and handles it on its own conventional defense. Some people are already calling it, well, quote, NATO 3.0, which sounds a lot nicer than we're counting the exits. Well, whatever you call it, the actual number that matters here, how many American troops are standing on Polish and Baltic soil, the number that makes an attack on them automatically an attack on the US. The actual tripwire is being recounted right now, with the answer landing right around the moment the Wall Street Journal says the window opens, which is convenient timing at that. 2 data points on hard security. Here's the softer one, and it probably matters more. Late July, roughly 50 to 60,000 people crossed from Morocco into Spain's Ceuta enclave in 2 days. At least 57 died. Spanish officials blamed trafficking networks that exploited confusion around a Spanish Supreme Court ruling. A real crisis. No conspiracy required to explain the deaths. What happened next is the actual story. Italy suspended the Schengen agreement with Spain, 2 EU member states restricting free movement between each other over a crisis neither one caused. Here's where it gets speculative, and I want to be upfront about exactly what kind of claim it is. What follows is inference and not proof. But it's inference built on a documented precedent, not a guess pulled from nowhere. We know as confirmed fact that Netanyahu has run this exact play before. From 2012 to 2018, Qatar funneled over $1 billion into Gaza. Israeli approved from 2014 on cash payments in actual suitcases, because a Palestinian population split between Hamas in Gaza and Fatah in the West Bank can never unify behind one state. Netanyahu told his own party this outright in 2019: keep Hamas funded, keep the flames controlled. When he later denied it, Time fact-checked him against his own words, and the denial didn't survive. So when Spain becomes Europe's loudest critic of Israel's Gaza and Iran operations, refusing US bases, refusing airspace, and a chaotic migrant surge conveniently destabilizes exactly that country weeks later, you don't need a conspiracy theory. You need to ask whether a government with a confirmed history of using controlled chaos as a policy is running the play again. There's even a 2019 tweet from Netanyahu's own son, Yair Netanyahu, cheering on this exact pressure campaign against Spain over Ceuta specifically on its own, which proves nothing about 2026, supposedly, but it says a lot. But it tells you the idea was already in the family's head years before any of this happened. Morocco denies orchestrating anything, and the trafficking network explanation needs no Israeli involvement at all. But this government has done exactly this before at massive scale with an active motive to do it again. Is a very different claim than someone found an old tweet. Weigh it accordingly. Put all of it together, a live rehearsal or cover pattern at Zapad, a garrisoned Kaliningrad sitting across from a brigade-strength NATO response, Turkey's active but unescalated defense, Greenland's loud-but-toothless economic pushback, and Ceuta's demonstrated willingness for EU states to turn on each other, and the Suwałki Gap stops being a line on a map, it becomes the specific place all of it could converge. So when the Wall Street Journal report itself frames the window as fall 2026 through 2029, not a date, it's a range, and worth taking that range seriously rather than rounding it to a single moment. But there's a real argument for sooner rather than later inside that window, and it's sitting in the fortification numbers already covered. Poland's East Shield had secured just 60 of its planned 700 kilometers by the end of last year. Lithuania's Suwalki training facility and its tank assembly line doesn't fully come online until the end of the decade. Every month this window stays open, the specific vulnerability gets a little more concrete, a little less deniable to slip through. If you're Moscow and the goal is testing the gap while it's still a gap, the incentive isn't to point towards waiting. Watch for the same signals that preceded 2022. As a pad-scale exercise that doesn't stand down on schedule. Unusual troop movements inside Belarus that outlast the drill. A protection pretext aimed at Russian-speaking populations in the Baltic. The same minority protection language Russia has used before. And worth noticing, the same language Turkey has used against Cyprus and Israel has used in Syria. And watch for it timed to land during the kind of moment already covered here. A Ceuta, a Greenland-style intra-alliance fight, anything that keeps NATO's Article 4 convention going in circles instead of reaching Article 5. That's not a coincidence to watch for. That's the mechanism. To be precise about what this actually is, US intelligence itself calls a land incursion low probability, even while saying that probability is rising, and it is. This isn't a prediction that it happens on a specific date, which, in this time frame in like the fall 2026, it probably can happen. It's a map of where the pressure actually sits and where, and roughly when, approximately to watch. Ceuta already showed the lack of cohesion between Europe and the potential for Israel to leverage asymmetric warfare to destabilize an opponent. This summer, that pressure doesn't need to come from Moscow at all to do Moscow's work for it. If you like these videos, please subscribe and consider subscribing to my Patreon.